Well, it's another good Saturday afternoon here in the high country of Santa Fe, New Mexico. It has been cold these last few days and windy, but that's what you expect in the high country, especially in the wintertime. And you're listening to Barrier-Free Futures on this cold Saturday afternoon. We're streaming live on the web at KSFR.org, and you can also get a podcast of Barrier-Free Futures by going in on your browser and typing in Barrier-Free Futures, all one line, dot Libsyn, LIBSYN.com. That's barrier-free-futures.libsyn.com. And on this cold Saturday afternoon, I would like to congratulate the Brain Injury Resource Center, which had its grand opening just this past week, and they will be housed at ARCA in Albuquerque, and the Resource Center is for those folks, and there are many of us, I include myself, with brain injuries all across the state of New Mexico that need resources to understand how to best come to grips with so many of the issues that you deal with brain injury. Well, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest this Saturday afternoon. It's Dr. Jacob Vigil, who is an associate professor in psychology at the University of New Mexico. Now, being an associate professor in psychology is not what Dr. Vigil is here to talk about this afternoon. It is his research into the benefits and effects of medical marijuana. And I know you've just gotten recently a grant, Dr. Vigil, but I'd like to welcome you to Barrier-Free Futures.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
And could you kind of go over the work that you've done and then talk about the grant that you've gotten to get into this, further into this research?
Well, sure. This is actually an evolving process. I don't have a current grant, but I could tell you the history of where we're at. So I got tenure a couple years ago, and that provided the personal security to be able to advocate in this area of medical marijuana research. It's something that's still stigmatized in academic settings, unfortunately. There's a lot of big dollars at stake, and there's a lot of folks that are trying to maintain the current status quo of how our healthcare is delivered. But I've been working on trying to conduct clinical trials for several years, only to face federal barriers that restricted my ability to really conduct the type of research that would most benefit people in this area. So, for example, I was studying how cannabis might affect pain perception at a real basic level, and of course, I was facing federal barriers, and that I had to get in a new drug application through. I had to get approval from the DEA, had to get an approval from NIDA, and then likewise, I have come to realize that there are constraints even to the type of research that the government does fund. So, for example, a lot of the research that's been conducted has been done with very low potency THC levels, which does not replicate what people use in nature or in their natural setting. So I've been working with the University of New Mexico for several years to put together protocols that would allow me to assess both the safety and efficacy of medical cannabis. Now, currently we've conducted a number of studies looking at the efficacy of the medical cannabis program in general. So how is it affecting folks' health, their well-being? How is it affecting, for example, their narcotic use? Obviously, we know the number one preventable cause of death in the United States has unfortunately been a consequence of big pharma and our current healthcare delivery system. So that is the number of deaths that are the result of overdose from opiates. So it's intriguing
and Dr.
that...
Vigil,
Sure. Yes, sir.
is that part of the barrier that you have to deal with in trying to conduct research? Is that the pharmaceuticals make billions upon billions of dollars on these opiate drugs that go out, and you just mentioned the high number. I don't know an actual number, but
We could put 165,000 deaths on the hands of big pharma as a result of overdoses on prescriptions alone. So we're not even talking heroin, and this is in the past about 14 years. So a lot of Americans have unfortunately met their demise as a result of our healthcare system.
And that use of pharmaceuticals is so widely accepted, and people have become so afraid, and I say the majority of people, probably of the utilization of marijuana because of all of the hype against marijuana that came out with some of the stuff that happened back in the 40s and 50s, and especially with the just say no to drugs. And
Sure.
unfortunately, it was not just saying no to opiates, but it would just say no to street drugs. And that is something that, certainly has come into play in trying to reduce this stigma, has it not?
Sure. So as you said, there's been tremendous barriers. There's been financial interest. The way that I see it is that big pharma has been very successful at hustling the American people into being conditioned that all of our health care could only be delivered in a pill that they manufacture synthetically. And we've come to accept that our health care could only be delivered by these manufacturers of synthetic products. And as I said, it's been a very successful business venture for the past nearly 100 years now. And, in 2016, we're smarter than ever before. We have more technological advancements. We know more about the human body than ever before. And this is one area that we're still lacking. But there's no reason why we can't improve our health care. And there's no reason why we shouldn't revert back to more natural products to be able to do so. So in terms of some of the harm that big pharma has caused, for example, 94% of heroin users say that they got started on prescription opiate pills. So the heroin epidemic is tremendous. It's all over the United States. It's hitting close to home really hard in northern New Mexico as well. And the vast majority of these patients get hooked through traditional, conventional patterns whereby you go in for an operation, they give you some opiates, basically you get hooked on them, and they become too expensive, and then people revert to street drugs thereafter. And this is something that we know occurs. We know that there's a number of deaths that are the result of big pharma. I would not be surprised if big pharma has not suppressed medical marijuana research showing that it's safer and more effective than A, B, and C.
Well, and again, it's hard not to see the pharmaceuticals because everybody watches television, and it seems like every other advertising on television, whether it's a soap opera or a sporting event, you see advertising for pills. And this pill will do this, and then, there's 30 seconds of side effects that people just kind of slough off. And that's something that with traditional medicine, you also have side effects, but those side effects sound to me like they're relatively minimal compared to the things that come from big pharma.
Sure. And unfortunately, we've become addicted as a society to using narcotics. It was once thought of as an effective long-term pain treatment option. And we now know that it doesn't cure people's pain in the long haul. There's many different reasons why our brain perceives a painful experience, pain perception. And there's ways that we could tinker with the brain, that we could condition the brain, that we could put the brain in a certain type of environment, either physical or mental, that naturally reduces pain. And these alternatives, including the intervention, perhaps of medical cannabis, presumably are going to be much more effective for the long haul in treating pain without the negative consequences, as you said, of opiate dependence, which unfortunately tends to take its toll in many aspects of people's lives, socially, physically, removes them from the workforce, changes their personality, and on and on.
Well, one of the things you mentioned in the beginning I want to go back to, and that was the barriers that you encountered with the Drug Enforcement Agency, and you mentioned the, was it the NID?
No, so a researcher would need to get an investigational new drug approval from the FDA. So actually my wife and I wrote about this, and we published this in Science Magazine a couple months back. But we were basically highlighting all these barriers. So not only do you have to get approval from all these independent agencies, any one of them could refuse you approval, but you need to apply for an investigational new drug application, which presumably is not really relevant for a natural product that you're not synthesizing, that you're not constructing itself, and then particularly with regard to all the varied species and types of, for example, cannabis out there, it doesn't make sense that you would need to apply for an investigational new drug for a natural product, especially if you're measuring something as benign and as useful as something like driving impairment. So how does cannabis affect driving impairment? Why would you have to go through 10 years of hurdles to be able to measure something so important in our society?
Well, it's really hard to comprehend that, but I think that goes back to the the fear of street drugs and the real stigma that was placed on marijuana, that marijuana leads to cocaine and then to heroin and all of the other. This is the starter drug that folks are using, and that just didn't seem to prove out, did it?
As a matter of fact, not only does it not seem to be an actual gateway drug, there's building evidence that it could be effective at reducing drug dependence, so prescription dependence. So in essence, it seems to be a treatment for drug abuse rather than a gateway drug.
And when you say a treatment for drug abuse, what do you mean?
Well, we're conducting several studies, basically measuring people's prescription narcotic use, sedative use, stimulant use, and so forth. And we have some preliminary evidence that cannabis might be helpful in reducing the absolute volume of prescription pills that people are taking.
And this is something that you have to prove out over time?
Well, this is something that we would measure longitudinally. So I have a number of studies that are basically allowing us to tap into people's medical records. So I have consent from participants, obviously, and I've gone through all the institutional review boards for human protection and so forth. But we're able to essentially not only take a snapshot, but monitor the types of prescriptions that we as patients are not only being prescribed, but filling and using and so forth. So I can measure medication usage over time with respect to enrollment in the medical cannabis program, how much cannabis people are using, other aspects of mental and physical functioning, and so forth. So these are some of the studies that we're conducting at UNM, at the University of New Mexico, and that's why I established the Medical Cannabis Research Fund. So basically this fund was designed to allow the general public to directly donate and support the type of research that they feel is going to be most important for themselves, their family, and their community. Because of these federal barriers, not only is it incredibly difficult to not only get approval to do studies, but it's even that much more difficult to get funding. And studies are expensive. So if you're working with cancer patients, pediatric patients, longitudinal studies, where you're tracking people over time, these are very expensive ventures. So I established this Cannabis Research Fund at the University of New Mexico to allow the general public to sponsor this work, to support it, to drive it directly.
Well, hopefully that's something that will play out not only in the long run, but the short run, where we can begin to get the stigma taken off, and people will be able to utilize something that seems to be much more effective than the synthetic pharmaceuticals that people are institutionalized into. But right now, Dr. Vigil, need to take a short break. I'm talking with Dr. Jacob Vigil. He is a medical marijuana researcher at the University of New Mexico, and you're listening to Barrier-Free Futures. We'll be right back after these messages. I'm back now with Dr. Jacob Vigil. Jacob Vigil is a associate professor in psychology at the University of New Mexico, and he is studying the positive effects of medical marijuana. And let me just tell you again that if you'd like a podcast of this, please go to barrierfreefutures.libsyn, LIBSYN.com. And Dr. Vigil, would you pick up where we were talking about in relationship to the difficulties and the fund that you've set up there at UNM?
Sure. So, again, the difficulties are pretty pervasive. Big Pharma has been working with the legislation at a federal level and until now at a state level to basically restrict the opportunity for objective, strong, well-qualified researchers to be able to study not only the safety but also the efficacy of medical marijuana. So the National Institute of Health basically sponsors, supports hundreds of studies every year on the ill effects of cannabis. And they essentially support very, very few, in fact, less than 1% of studies on any possible medical effects of cannabis use. And unfortunately, yes, sir.
Do you see most of the potential coming out of the states that it seems like now we have, I think about half of the states allow medical marijuana usage across the country, and that seems to be a step in the right direction.
Sure. Not only is it a step in the right direction, but it's going to force clear-headed politicians to be able to come to terms with the reality of the situation. There's a number of studies out there showing, for example, that the states that have enacted medical cannabis laws that have allowed individuals the option to be able to take cannabis have experienced up to a 33% reduction in opiate-related deaths. That means 1 in 3 people that would have otherwise died as a result of being restricted from the opportunity to self-medicate are still alive. Now, that's amazing. There's other studies showing that opiate-related accidents are dramatically down. And as I mentioned, we're conducting a number of studies here at UNM that's showing incredible benefits, particularly in reducing and treating medication dependence here.
Well, that seems to be an issue that you're going to be facing for a while. And one of the things that I know is a real barrier is marijuana is a Class 1 drug as classified by the DEA, and trying to get that classification reduced would certainly be a benefit to you, but how do you do that when there seems to be such resistance at the federal level where it's classified, even though we see so much progress on the state level?
Sure. And I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. People are always asking me what do I predict that, the state of the circumstances will be in 5 years and so forth. Is the FDA going to take control over it? Similar issues regard CBD products that don't have THC. Obviously, those types of products are very popular. There's a lot of advocacy for them. People swear by them and so forth. And I just don't know what the future state is going to look like. I do know as a psychologist that human beings are conflicted with conflicts of interest. And with so much money at stake, with so much money, you didn't mention the trillions of dollars that basically support Big Pharma in Western society. It's a lot of money. And there's inherent and gigantic conflicts of interest that I don't think are going to be worked out very quickly. And I think until that point, the federal government's doing the right job by allowing states to be able to vote on what they think is best for their populace. And I'm hoping that Donald Trump will advocate in the same manner. I have all the confidence in the world that he's going to do so.
Well, let's hope so. That's just one more thing that, we'd like to see the president-elect come to grips with for the public,
Sure.
and that's to really not just, he can't allow it himself, but to push for the idea of cannabis research and certainly utilization of
Well, he's
medical
running
cannabis.
against corruption, and this is probably one of the biggest sources and expressions of corruption in our society.
Well, I hope the idea certainly takes firm grip and that people in the country will push for that support. Here on the state level, how do you go about trying to push it on the state level? I know you had difficulty with even trying to get research through the legislature there at UNM, even though, it was supported in one committee and got voted out of a second one by one vote. But there is such a resistance by some of the legislature.
Well, we have some growing pains here. So as you mentioned, collaborator Dr. Anthony Reeve and I wrote the initial medical cannabis research bill a couple years back, and representatives still continue to push it forward. I'm sure it's going to come through eventually. We do have growing pains here in New Mexico. So, for example, one of the biggest problems that I see is the lack of compliance and enforcement with regard to testing of the medical marijuana that's sold to patients. Unfortunately, this is an industry that is largely cloaked in shadows. The government has been trying to implement a system that basically tracks testing results and making sure that there's no, under-the-counter products that are being sold to patients without being tested and so forth. But at this point, there's nobody actually looking at those records. So they have a bio-tracking system, and there's no individuals that monitor it in any way. So there's no actual consequence to not testing products. And we've come to a state here in New Mexico where it, in some circles, is conventional practice to actually convert dirty products, so products that are contaminated with Salmonella, E. coli, or whatever, into the form of product that is not tested in general, which are edibles. So I don't know if most patients know this, but edibles are not tested for microbiological contamination, which makes no sense, as obviously bacteria could be introduced at any stage in the process, in the manufacturing, the cooking, the storage, how it's stored on the shelves of dispensaries and so forth. So there needs to be much greater advocacy for patient safety here at the state level. And I am a loud, vocal, basically proponent and supporter and fighter for patient rights and safety here in New Mexico. And I've been working with the state, but I'm still quite frustrated with where we're at.
And that you mentioned something that certainly doesn't get brought up, and that's the idea that there's so much potential contamination.
Sure.
And because you don't have the opportunity, and the state doesn't really go in and review what's going on, and do you suspect, I'm sure you don't have research on this, but suspect that, people may be harmed by this?
There's no doubt. I know of several cases currently under litigation. There's no doubt that dispensers are putting themselves at risk, not only their patients, but they're putting themselves at risk of being sued for, when patients do eventually get sick. So, these forms of bacteria are regulated in the food industry for a reason, because they're common and they make people sick, particularly people that have compromised health systems. And, there's a lot of face value to the support of patient safety and so forth, but at a deeper level, I wish it was more pervasive.
And that's something that I'm certain that as we move along this timeline and, medical marijuana becomes more pervasive, it just seems like the legislatures at the state level we'll certainly have to do something to begin to address this issue, don't you think?
I believe so. And if it's all about patient safety and well-being, then their immediate safety should be of the utmost priority. Obviously, the federal government doesn't regulate the safety of cannabis, but many other states are doing so effectively, and we need to catch up here in New Mexico.
And, just in relationship to New Mexico and the closeness of Colorado, is there any cross-connection with Colorado and New Mexico?
I don't know. I don't know. In terms of research collaboration, I'm not aware of a lot of, big investigative teams that are collaborating. But in terms of the industry, I would imagine so. I don't know all the regulations across the different sectors, obviously.
Yeah, that just, until we get some type of consistent regulation across the country and,
I think the patients are going to need to demand, basically more quality proficiency of the medications that they're using. Patients have the option to go to different dispensaries. Dispensaries are making tons of money. It's obvious they're popping up everywhere. And patients are really holding the true voice. And I ultimately think that they have the power to be able to advocate for what's in their best interest through their dollars.
Well, and that's always, a real powerful tool is the consumer. And especially, I would think at this, in New Mexico, relatively early stage of the so-called game of medical marijuana in our state. Well, Dr. Vigil, we're getting closer to the end of the program. And is there anything that, you would like to say as we close up and way to get in touch with you?
Sure. As I mentioned, I am basically spending about 110% of my time advocating for, conducting, and basically pushing the frontier of medical cannabis research here in New Mexico. There's no reason why we shouldn't be pioneering this area of research in the world. We shouldn't be leading the world in this area of research, and certainly we have an immediate need. I would just suggest that for all those out there that feel strongly about needing stronger investigations on both the safety and efficacy of medical cannabis, we have a mechanism set up to be able to donate and directly support that research. So this would go directly to formal research that is conducted by all the different types of professionals and specialists we have available at UNM. So we have experts, obviously, in areas of Alzheimer's, autism, cancer, pain perception, many aspects of cognitive functioning and so forth. So we have all the tools and innovation to be able to conduct any type of research at UNM. And I would strongly suggest that for those that advocate for medical marijuana research, that they go to the Medical Cannabis Research Fund.
Well, Dr. Vigil, I really want to thank you for being on Barrier-Free Futures this Saturday afternoon. And I think you could go to the UNM website and the Department of Psychology and find information about Dr. Vigil. You've been listening to Barrier-Free Futures. This is Jim Parker saying we'll see you next time.